Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to be tackling a subject that's been in the headlines quite a bit. That would be deaths resulting from police violence. And we all know the conversation often centers around racial disparities, and rightfully so. But this time, we're going to explore a different angle, one that might surprise you: gender.
Absolutely. We've got some pretty interesting data and analysis here. It looks at both racial and gender disparities in these tragic incidents, and some of the findings are pretty eye-opening. Men are significantly more likely to die during interactions with the police than women, even more so than the difference we see between racial groups, which is pretty striking.
Yeah, but let's just jump right in. Here it is.
In the data skies, we take our flight. Trends and numbers come to life. Colors and charts, they dance and play, showing truth in a visual way. In GenderDecoded, we uncover truths and stories like no other. In the data waves we find the secret maps of humankind.
So we've got this data visualization and analysis in front of us. Before we jump into the gender aspect, can you quickly remind us about the racial disparities that we're more familiar with?
Sure. The analysis shows that Black individuals are 2.5 times more likely to die from police violence compared to white individuals. This disparity is deeply rooted in systemic racism and over-policing, issues we've talked about before.
Right. It's not a new concept. But you mentioned that the gender gap is even larger.
Much larger, yeah. Get ready for this number because it's really startling. Men are 24 times more likely to die in police encounters than women.
24 times. Wow. That is, I don't even know what to say to that. It completely reframes this whole conversation. What could possibly explain such a massive gap?
Well, the analysis points to several factors, but the primary one is the influence of societal expectations around masculinity.
Okay, I can see how that could play a role. But how exactly does the analysis connect those expectations to these tragic outcomes?
Well, it highlights how our culture often equates masculinity with aggression, dominance, and risk-taking. These behaviors, while not inherently negative, can lead to more confrontational situations, potentially escalating encounters with law enforcement.
So a man might be more likely to challenge authority or resist arrest due to these ingrained expectations of what it means to be a man.
That's one possible interpretation. And remember, it's not just about individual behavior. These ingrained societal norms can also influence how officers perceive and react to men, especially men of color.
So we're talking about unconscious bias based on these deeply rooted stereotypes about masculinity.
Precisely. And to give you a concrete example from the analysis, consider male-dominated environments like construction sites or high-crime areas. Men are statistically more likely to be present in these settings, which inherently increases their chances of interacting with law enforcement, often in already tense situations.
That makes a lot of sense. And of course, these environments often overlap with communities of color, which adds yet another layer of complexity to the issue.
Exactly. We can't ignore the intersectionality at play here. Black men facing both racial bias and this masculinity factor are unfortunately at the highest risk. To fully understand the scope of this problem, we need to consider how these identities overlap and amplify the dangers.
Yeah, it's a tough reality to face, that some of the very things that society tells men they should be can actually put them in harm's way.
It really is. It's a sobering thought. And it raises a lot of questions about how we can challenge these harmful norms and create a safer world for everyone, regardless of gender or race. Yeah, it really is a sobering reality, isn't it? We've been talking about some of the reasons why men, especially Black men, are disproportionately victims of police violence. But we can't ignore the other side of that statistic. If men are 24 times more likely to die in these encounters, what does that say about women's experiences?
That's a good point. We've been focusing on why men might be at higher risk, but we haven't really talked about the flip side. What does the analysis say about how women are perceived and treated in these situations?
It suggests that women generally benefit from being seen as less threatening. This perception, while rooted in outdated gender stereotypes, appears to be a protective factor for them in these interactions.
That's interesting. But it's a little unsettling, too, isn't it? We're essentially saying that harmful stereotypes about women being weaker or less aggressive might actually be keeping them safer during police encounters.
It's definitely a complicated issue. We're talking about deeply ingrained gender roles here and how they play out in these very intense life or death situations. The analysis highlights how these societal norms, even when based on harmful stereotypes, can have very real consequences.
It makes you wonder, though, are there other factors at play here as well?
Yeah.
The analysis mentioned men being more likely to be in high-crime areas, but statistically, women are also less likely to commit violent crimes. Could that be a contributing factor to the gender gap, too?
Absolutely. It's important to consider that men are more likely to be both the perpetrators and victims of violent crime. This is reflected in crime statistics across the board and likely contributes to the disparity we see in police violence fatalities. So it's not just about perceptions and behaviors, but also about the circumstances in which men and women are more likely to encounter law enforcement in the first place.
Okay, so we've got these intertwined factors. Societal expectations of masculinity, the prevalence of men in high-crime environments, and even the statistical likelihood of men being involved in violent crime. It paints a pretty bleak picture. But are there any glimmers of hope in this analysis? Like, what can we actually do to address this huge gender gap in police violence?
Well, it's a complex problem, so the solutions aren't going to be simple either. But the analysis does offer some potential starting points for us.
Okay, I'm all ears. Where do we even begin to tackle something like this?
Well, one key area the analysis highlights is the need for policy changes within law enforcement.
No, okay. You mean things like mandatory body cameras and independent investigations of police shootings?
Those are definitely important tools for accountability. But the analysis goes a step further. It emphasizes the need for specific training programs that address both racial and gender biases.
So not just teaching officers to recognize their own biases, but also helping them understand how those biases might manifest differently based on the gender of the person they're interacting with.
Exactly. And it's not just about theoretical awareness either. It's about equipping officers with practical strategies to de-escalate situations, especially when dealing with men who might be perceived as more aggressive or resistant based on those harmful stereotypes we've been talking about.
So instead of automatically resorting to force, officers would have the training and tools to assess situations more accurately and respond in a way that's appropriate to the individual and the circumstances, regardless of gender.
Precisely. It's about creating a more nuanced and equitable approach to policing, recognizing that one size does not fit all.
That makes sense. But are there other approaches we should be considering as well? It feels like changing the culture within law enforcement is only part of the solution.
You're absolutely right. The analysis stresses that real change requires a multifaceted approach. Addressing those deeply rooted societal norms and expectations around masculinity is absolutely crucial.
So it's not just about reforming law enforcement. It's also about challenging those harmful stereotypes that contribute to these disparities in the first place.
Exactly. It's a long-term project, but it requires a shift in our cultural landscape. We need to promote healthier, more inclusive ideas about masculinity, both in our personal lives and through media representation.
That's a big undertaking. It feels almost overwhelming to think about tackling such deeply ingrained societal beliefs. Where do we even begin with something like that?
Well, there are already organizations and individuals doing amazing work in this area, challenging toxic masculinity, promoting positive male role models, encouraging open conversations about emotions and vulnerability. These are all important steps in the right direction.
That is encouraging, but it sounds like a cultural shift of that magnitude requires a collective effort from all of us. Parents, educators, media creators, everyone has a role to play in reshaping those narratives.
You hit the nail on the head. It's about changing the very fabric of our society. One conversation, one interaction, one story at a time.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. It's clear that we're dealing with a deeply complex issue, but I appreciate the analysis highlighting these potential pathways forward.
I agree. And remember, the most important step is awareness. By acknowledging the problem and understanding the underlying factors, we can start to advocate for meaningful change.
So we've been unpacking some really heavy stuff today, exploring this alarming gender disparity in police violence fatalities. We've talked about societal expectations, unconscious bias, and the need for both individual and systemic change. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important to just acknowledge the weight of this issue. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real lives lost and the devastating impact on families and communities.
Absolutely. And while this conversation has been challenging, it's also been incredibly insightful. I feel like we're starting to grasp the complexity of this problem and identify those potential solutions.
I think that's encouraging. And speaking of solutions, I think it's important to revisit one point this analysis really emphasizes: the need for systemic change within law enforcement.
Right, we touched on that earlier, talking about body cameras and independent investigations, but I'm sensing there's more to it than that. What else did the analysis suggest?
Well, it goes beyond just individual accountability. It calls for a more fundamental shift in the power dynamics. It highlights the need for more civilian oversight of police conduct, things like community review boards, with real authority to investigate complaints and hold officers accountable for misconduct.
So giving communities a more direct role in shaping how they're policed.
Exactly. And it's not just about holding officers accountable after the fact. The analysis also advocates for policies that prioritize de-escalation and conflict resolution, shifting the focus from force to communication and community engagement.
So changing the very culture of policing, moving away from an us versus them mentality to one of collaboration and mutual respect.
That's the idea. It's a long and challenging process, of course. It requires buy-in from both law enforcement and the communities they serve.
It feels like a lot of the solutions we've discussed today, whether it's addressing those harmful stereotypes about masculinity or transforming the culture of policing, they all require a fundamental shift in perspective.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that this isn't just a law enforcement problem or a men's issue. It's a societal issue that we all have a responsibility to address.
So it's not enough to just be aware of the problem.
Yeah.
We need to be actively working to dismantle those harmful systems and create a world where everyone feels safe and respected, regardless of their gender or race.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think the analysis ends on a really powerful question that we can all ponder as we move forward.
Okay, I'm ready. What's the question?
It asks, how can we advocate for men's safety, especially the safety of Black men, in a way that works in tandem with, rather than against, the broader movement for racial justice?
Wow, that's a powerful question. It really challenges us to think critically and creatively about how we approach these issues.
Exactly. It's a reminder that these issues are interconnected. We can't address gender disparities in police violence without also confronting systemic racism and working to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality.
It's about finding solutions that uplift and protect everyone, not just certain groups. It's about solidarity, not division.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important message to hold on to as we continue to grapple with these complex and challenging issues.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive. We've covered a lot of heavy material today, but I feel like we've also gained some really valuable insights and a renewed sense of purpose.
I agree. And I hope your listeners are feeling the same way. This is a conversation that needs to continue, both in our personal lives and in the public sphere.
Absolutely. We need to keep talking, keep learning, keep challenging ourselves and each other, and keep pushing for change.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.